Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crime Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. In today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the revolutions of 1848 had succeeded? Now for those of you who are from predominantly English speaking countries, I kind of get why for the most part you won't know about these revolutions because they don't really affect many places in the English speaking world apart from Ireland, and that's because of two reasons. One, most of these revolutions took place on the continent. Two, they're very complex. Like, even myself, who's quite a history nerd, I had to do a lot of research into this, and there's still bits of it I don't know all the ins and outs of. So really apologies if I do make any kind of mistakes. And then the third one is that unlike many of the revolutions that we read about, this one, it was successful in some parts, but by and large, they were kind of failures, right? So in this video, we're going to kind of dive into some of the nuances of this and how it changed from country to country. So just to start off, let's keep it very simple. It did succeed in some countries. So in Holland and in Denmark, it led to representative democracy. But before diving into the ins and outs of the different revolutions, what we have to do first is identify what the causes were, and then also what some of the main driving motivations of the people involved were. So one of the main causes for it was the so-called potato blight. Now a lot of people know about what happened in Ireland. We've obviously, the potato famine and many millions of people either starving to death or else having to immigrate, mainly to Britain and to the United States and Canada. However, what's little known for English-speaking people is that this crisis also affected most places on the continent as well. The only difference as to why it was in particular very bad in Ireland was because of the dependency of the Irish peasants on the potato crop, whereas in Europe their diet tended to be a little bit more balanced, so there wasn't as much of an issue with that. But still, nonetheless, it still did affect crop yields, across the continent, and so as a result, it led to a lot of very hungry people. Now, England was one of the few places that didn't have any revolutions, mainly because England's kind of psyche over the last, 200 or so years in particular, has been that we're a country that does reform, not revolution. In the famous words of George Dawson, reform delayed is revolution begun. So the idea that many people have in Britain is that through our liberal democratic reforms, we kind of make adjustments where need be, and so we don't have to make violent swings between one set of regime to another. Whereas on the continent, this didn't tend to really be the case at that time, because you still had absolute monarchs, in most of the countries in Europe. And so the main motivations for those revolutionaries on the continent were twofold. One, to give people bread and stuff, so the more working class people, the poorer people within these movements, they just wanted simple bread, they wanted education, they just wanted they wanted a say in things, they just wanted the bare necessities and things, right? Whereas the more middle class people were tired of the absolutism and they wanted to have a greater say in how the country itself was run. And so in a lot of European countries, these two competing classes, as it were, came together and tried to overthrow the autocratic system that they had in place. So the revolutions of 1848 began first of all in France in February of that year. So what you had in France after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 was a reinstitution of the Bourbon royal dynasty, which had been in power beforehand. So so you just end up having kind of a return to the old way with a few little tweaks. So people in France were still kind of annoyed by that, because they was we didn't have this big revolution to overthrow the king just to end up with a king from the exact same royal dynasty. Come on. And so there'd really been an attempt in 1830 to overthrow the monarchy, which failed. So if you watch Les Mis, that's what the depiction of that is. And so by 1848, people in France were really, really tired of this monarchy, and they wanted a return of a republic. And so what they did in February is, they did the classic French thing. They set up barricades. They took over Paris, and the king ended up fleeing to England. And so out of this vacuum, what the revolutionaries then end up doing is the classic thing of arguing after they've already been successful. And so this kind of division, this arguing about what the new republic would look like and how it would be set up, etc., this wasn't great. And so what ended up happening is a certain Louis Bonaparte, who is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte himself, right? And this guy, he basically took advantage of the situation and he rose to prominence, and then 4 years later did a coup d'etat and ended up installing himself as the authoritarian emperor of the French, Emperor Napoleon III, who we've covered in some of our other videos, so definitely check some of those out. So the revolution in France kind of, end up replacing one king who was at least a constitutional monarch with autocratic emperor. So yeah, there's kind of a lesson against like revolutions and how they tend to kind of go in cycles and you end up with a worse version of what you had before. But anyway, so let's first of all start by looking at France. So Napoleon III, if he'd never become emperor, first of all, as we discussed in our previous video on the Crimean War and what if that never happened, Napoleon III was a driving force in what ended up getting France involved in the Crimean War. So, it was pretty much his wanting to take dominance over the Middle East in terms of like who would be, what church would be dominant. Would it be the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church? And so his rivalries over this one issue is what dragged France and by extension Britain into this war. And so it's very unlikely that the Crimean War would have happened if you hadn't had Napoleon III taking control. Also, as we discussed in our last video about what if Germany never unified, so definitely check that out. A big part of the Franco-Prussian War was because Napoleon III, he was an easily triggered person, and so all it took was a telegram from Bismarck to insult France and its emperor, and he ended up like declaring war on Prussia, which he ended up then losing, and this led to the German Empire being established. Not in Berlin, but in the Palace of Versailles in Paris. So that was, so the Germans came in and destroyed the French and then set up their empire in the captured capital of the enemy. And so all the consequences of that war probably not happening. I mean, would Germany have unified under Prussia? It's debatable to whether it would have happened in that exact way, because obviously you're talking about a period of like at least 20 years after this fact, so it's then quite difficult to really weigh up with all the different things that kind of happen. So it's, we'll park that thought for now, but it's just something to consider. The second country which was most affected by this wasn't even a country at the time, and that was the soon-to-be country of Germany. Now, all the German states, as we discussed in our previous video, there was 39 of them after the Congress of Vienna, and all of them all squabbling and all divided. And so in 1848, the flames which had begun in France spread quickly to Germany. And so the liberal, democratic, constitutionalists of Germany came together and set up the Frankfurt Parliament, and it was there that they declared that they wanted a unified Germany that was going to be liberal, democratic and constitutional, in opposition to the various different autocratic states of Germany. But the question that they asked themselves was, which of the German states would unite them all? Because, you had all these different very small ones. It was quite difficult to get them to kind of all agree on that. You had Austria, which had its own empire, as we discussed in our previous video. So this is the time when they started debating about the gross deutsche Lösung and the kleinen deutsche Lösung. I still can't pronounce the German, sorry. But it's the greater German solution and the lesser German solution. The lesser one being the one that excludes Austria and the greater one being the one that includes Austria. So it's decided by the German nationalists that they would all coalesce around the Prussian king, because Prussia was the most powerful German state, which was almost wholly Germanic. So you'd expect that when King Friedrich William IV of Prussia was offered the crown, that he'd accept. But instead, he turned it down. Why did he turn it down? Because Prussia was run under autocratic lines, and the Prussian king would have none of this talk of democratic and liberal reform. As a matter of fact, he refused point blank to take this crown out from the gutter, as he said. So that's how little he thought of this kind of democratic reform. He was like, no, I'm not going to, it's a poison chalice, I'm not going to, even if it means being the king of all Germany, I'm not going to do it if it means giving up my absolute power. And yes, there end up being many uprisings in Prussia itself. They end up, for a time there was some like liberal reform, as there were in many of these other places in Germany. But once again, by summer, the revolutionaries started bickering with each other. And so as a result, the forces of the establishment closed in and the counter-revolution had begun. But you know what else has begun? the race to hit the like button. So you need to hit the like button right now, turn it blue. We're trying to hit 20 likes per video. So we're almost kind of getting there now. We're starting to get there a little bit more. Like each video is starting to have at least like 11 likes. So just help me, yeah, because the more people like it, then the more people watch it. We're already starting to see the numbers go up this month. So on Saturday, I'm going to be releasing a video celebrating the 6-month anniversary of this channel launching. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. We're going to be talking about a few more things about the journey. But yeah, so hit the like button, because then even more people can see us, then more people will watch that, and more people will watch the other things as well. And definitely, like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, and let's get back into the video. The next place we're going to look at was the Austrian Empire. So at this point, it hadn't yet become the Austro-Hungarian Empire that we all know about. But it was just called the Austrian Empire, and the Hungarians within it were not very happy, as were all the other various different groups within the empire. So as we discussed before, there were Czechs, there were Slovaks, there were Hungarians, Romanians, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, obviously Germans as well, like in Austria. It just was, it just was crazy. And so as a result, all these revolutions that took place in Germany end up then spreading to Austria. So as happened within Germany, the Germans within Austria wanted to have a liberal, unified German state, and so they wanted to disband the Austrian Empire and join with the rest of Germany, and also obviously to oppose the absolutism of the Austrian king. This had the knock-on effect of spurring all the other ethnic groups within Austria to then rise up, because they wanted to have their independence. And in particular, this was seen with the Hungarians, who were very, very fervent with it. So it wasn't until Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, when he sent in 300,000 troops to crush it, that it was actually suppressed. And this is just one of the most violent of all the crushings that took place of the revolutions in 1848. The forces of Prussia, Austria and Russia, who we discussed in the previous videos, were referred to as the Holy Alliance. These were the three powers that came together during this year to crush all the different democratic movements that took place on the continent. However, that's not to say that the revolutions had no impact at all, because all of the different monarchies within Europe had to accept some reforms, had to accept some things just to make peace with the revolutionaries. And so as a result, for instance, in the Austrian Empire, there ended up being abolition of serfdom. So serfdom is an institution that we've discussed in our video on what if the Russian Revolution never happened, so definitely check that out. And within the Austrian Empire, there was a greater level of autonomy and a greater level of democratic freedoms offered up to the people. And the same was true even within Prussia. There ended up being some reforms as a result of this. But where there ended up being a real crackdown on people was in Poland. So Poland, for those who don't know, was divided between Prussia, Austria and Russia in 1795. So this is the extinguishing of Poland as a nation state, and so Poland wouldn't re-emerge as a country until 1918. However, the revolutions that were taking place across the continent led a lot of the people, especially in the Polish nobility and the middle classes, to want to rise up because they wanted to, recreate independent Poland. However, the main problems with this were that it was very much a bourgeois revolution. Not want to sound like Karl Marx here, but yeah, it was very much like that. And actually what's funny is that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, in this exact year, in the middle of all this turmoil, because they saw it as the beginning of a kind of workers' revolution. So they really tried to spur that on. So the problem with the Polish revolutionaries was that the vast majority of people in Poland did not want to be on the same side as their aristocratic landlords. So even though Poland was occupied, the Polish nobility, which had ruled it previously, they still had control over the land, and these peasants were still beholden to them. And so they was like, hold on, we actually kind of like the Austrians. The Austrians are at least a kind of liberal force, and the only way that we're going to get any sort of freedom at all is through them. We certainly didn't get under you, so why would we want a return to Poland? And also it didn't help that many of the Polish revolutionaries turned against the Jews as well. And again, the Jews both in Prussian Poland and in Austrian Poland were like, yeah, we kind of like it better with these guys here, because at least they're kind of, at least they're likely to give us kind of equal rights. And so as a result, the Polish uprising ended up being crushed very quickly by the forces of Prussia and Austria. Now we're going to turn our attention to Italy. So Italy was very much like Germany. As we discussed in our last video, it's very divided amongst many different states, most of which didn't even speak the same language. They just had this general idea of what an Italian was, but Italian as we know today came from the region of Tuscany, so people in the south of Italy wouldn't be able to understand what the people in northern Italy were saying, and vice versa. So yeah, so the Italian nation state kind of began to get off the ground a little bit as an idea as a result of these revolutions, but the main hamper to them was the Austrian Empire. So Austria controlled a large part of northern Italy, and so the main obstacle to Italian independence was Austria. And so what the Italians did is they aligned more with the French and got the French to kind of get involved. However, this ended up being a failure as well, and so while there ended up being some democratic reforms in some states within Italy, this ended up basically getting crushed by the Austrians, and very quickly any of the surviving ones end up kind of reversing these reforms soon afterwards. Now finally we're going to be looking at the British Isles. Now we've discussed how Britain didn't have a revolution. However, they did have the Chartist movement, which was, you know, a big movement, yeah, of ordinary people demanding rights. So at that point, the only people who could vote in Britain were land owning, like, kind of aristocrats and stuff. And yeah, so a lot of people didn't have the right to vote. And so the Chartist movement was a huge movement that, you know, that involved millions of people, and they all signed a petition, yeah, and took it to Parliament and said, please can we have universal suffrage, yeah, for all men. And in response to this, the British Parliament went, yeah, we'll think about that. No. So as a result, yeah, in stark contrast to what ended up happening in the rest of the continent, when it ended up being like violent uprisings against the system, in Britain, people kind of was like, please can we have rights? And people went, nah, it's okay. And then finally, we're going to look at Ireland. So Ireland, as we discussed, was already really impacted by the potato famine. And obviously you'd had, you know, mass starvation, you had mass immigration, like kind of out of Ireland, because people, you know, were starving, and they needed to get jobs and to feed their families. And so the lack of response from the British government, yeah, who purposely kind of like didn't help the Irish, yeah, and just kind of let them, like, they said it was laissez-faire. They was like, oh, we'll just like let the market kind of decide and stuff, but they didn't do anything to help the Irish, and they wouldn't have done the same thing in Britain. They certainly wouldn't have let like millions of people go hungry like that. And so as a result, many people in Ireland were super annoyed, yeah, by the British Empire. And so this led to the Young Islander Rebellion of that year, in which, you know, Irish nationalists wanted to rise up and wanted to set up a liberal, independent Irish Republic separate from Britain. And as you can imagine, this was crushed by the British Army. So, you know, so both in Britain and in Ireland, the revolution didn't even really take off the ground. They were kind of crushed in their infancy. And so, yeah, so this is pretty much the revolutions of 1848. Very quickly summarized. It's so much more complex than this. It will take me literally like days to go into it. So I really encourage you to do further research into this. But now we've kind of got the bare bones under wraps here, right? Now we can start talking finally about the alternative histories. So if these different revolutions had actually succeeded, what would have happened? Well, what's funny about these revolutions is that everything that people wanted to happen in that year ended up kind of being done by 1918. So 70 years later, with World War One, you end up having universal suffrage, not even just for men, which was just like what people in this time wanted, yeah. But you end up having universal suffrage for men and for women. And even decades after the Chartist movement, you end up having, you know, different acts of parliament which expanded the franchise. So, you know, even before 1918, where all men and nearly all women end up getting the right to vote, you still had a situation where people were like, oh, okay, cool, well, now we'll allow the middle class to vote. The franchise ended up being gradually kind of expanded anyway. It just, you know, it was delayed by a few decades. And then on the continent, you know, France ended up, you know, having this coup d'etat in which Napoleon III took over. But by 1871, with the defeat of France at the hand of the Prussians, they end up establishing a third French Republic. So in France, it just kind of kicked the can down the road by like 20 years, and that's kind of all it did. Similarly in Austria as well, by 1867 you had the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. So this was basically saying that Austria is going to be a dual monarchy with Hungary. So this is where the Austro-Hungarian Empire finally comes into being, and so the Hungarians now have equal say within the empire. And then the Austro-Hungarian Empire ended up collapsing anyway at the end of World War I. And so as a result, you end up seeing all of Eastern Europe get its independence. You know, you see Czechoslovakia, you see Poland, you see Yugoslavia, you see many of these places get their independence. And so yeah, the borders of Europe end up being drawn along ethnic lines, and nearly all of these new countries end up being either constitutional monarchies or end up being constitutional republics. And so the vision of a democratic Europe end up being established by 1918. However, I'd say that the main focus in this video of what could have gone differently is the central thing of Germany. So the Prussian king not accepting the crown of all the Germans, and therefore not allowing there to be a constitutional democratic Germany at that time, this had long-lasting effects which, in my opinion, led to World War I. So what I mean by that is this. Otto von Bismarck, who we discussed in the previous video on German unification, he was a staunch conservative, he was a staunch autocrat, and he was against any kind of like liberal democratic reforms. However, he saw in the failures of 1848 what ought to be done in order to unite the Germans under a unified state, and in particular under a unified Prussian state. And he said famously that, actually, let me get the quote perfect. The great questions of the day will be decided not by speeches and by majority votes. That was the failures of 1848. But by blood and iron. That is, by warfare and industrial might. So basically what Bismarck had in plan, and what he later ended up executing, was unifying Germany not by peaceful means, not by democratic means, but through blood and iron, through warfare, and by uniting the German people under one banner, whether they wanted to or not, through the military might of the Prussian war machine. And this had far-reaching consequences, because a big reason why Germany ended up going to war in World War I was because the Kaiser, while he did allow there to be some domestic reforms, you know, they did allow there to be a Reichstag in which, you know, people were able to vote and decide on different things, but that was for domestic policy. When it came to foreign policy and when it came to the military, he was in charge. He was the sole person who was in charge, and his decisions, his whims, his grievances and his spite led to Germany being dragged into World War I, because he wanted Germany to be a powerful country so that he would be seen as a powerful leader. It was not in the interest of the Germans, it was in the interest of his own power and prestige. And if there had in fact been a liberal democratic German state, which, you know, could have included some aspects of Prussian militarism, could have included many of these different things. But the fact that foreign policy was in the hands of the Kaiser and was not accountable to the German people, this was the first step on the long road to an inevitable war. And so if this might have been avoided, then all the tragedy that came from World War I may not have happened. All the revolutions of 1848 came to pass within the space of 70 years. Even Ireland ended up getting its independence in 1922. And so you might say that the revolutions of 1848 were failures, but in the long run, they were successes. The only tragedy for us in Europe is that it couldn't have happened much sooner. So anyway, that was a cheery video. The next video is going to be on a slightly lighter topic, which was what if the beer hall putsch was successful? So those who don't know, obviously that's when Hitler tried to do a coup and tried to take power in Germany, but it ended up being a failure and ended up getting arrested. So yeah, that's what we're going to discuss next time. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And yeah, if you enjoyed the video, definitely don't forget to hit the like button, share with your friends, subscribe, and also watch a lot more of our great videos. We've got some of them captioned now. So yeah, definitely check them out if you've got a bit of free time. And if not, make some free time. But anyway, thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.